Hello everyone, welcome to the very first episode of the Sparkin Over Broncos Podcast, the show where we spark conversation about our Denver Broncos. I am your host, Gage Madrid, and on today's episode, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Broncos players who are scheduled to be free agents when the new league year commences on March 16th. The Denver Broncos have several key players who are scheduled to hit the open market. General Manager George Paton and head coach Nathaniel Hackett are going to have several key decisions to make as the calendar approaches March 16th. Today, we're going to take a look at which Broncos free agents the team should consider retaining, which players the team should consider moving on from, and what position groups the team should target in free agency and the draft. But before we get into that, a couple of housekeeping matters to attend to. We're trying to grow this community and include as many people in the conversation as possible. So a like on this video would be greatly appreciated. It would really go a long way. If you would like to add to the conversation, please feel inclined to leave a comment in the comment section below. I'd really love to hear from you. And speaking of, I'd really appreciate it if you gave me a follow on Twitter at Gage Madrid NFL for more conversation and more coverage of the NFL as well as your Denver Broncos. Would love to hear from you. Switching back over to the Broncos free agents, I feel they're in a really interesting spot. As of recording this video, the Broncos are sitting at just over $39 million in salary cap space. Obviously, the team does have needs that they're going to want to take a look at in free agency and in the draft, and we'll discuss that in an in-depth in a further video. That being said, I do feel that this team is going to have some guys who they're going to want to retain, as well as some guys they may want to tender. So let's get into how I would approach the Broncos offseason if I were head coach Nathaniel Hackett and general manager George Paton.
So starting off with the players that I would look to move on from, and I want to make it clear that just because a player is on this list doesn't mean that I don't like the player or think that they aren't good. I just feel that it would be in the better interest of the team to let these guys test the open market. Starting with offense, and the first name on this list, and that is, of course, quarterback Teddy Bridgewater. As you know, Teddy was acquired in a trade with the Carolina Panthers in the 2021 offseason in exchange for a 2021 6th-round pick. As part of the terms of the trade, the Panthers agreed to absorb a majority of Teddy's 21 salary, just essentially making him a cheap one-year rental. Teddy ended up winning the starting job over Drew Lock in training camp, and I feel the best way you could describe his 2021 season is up and down. And hey, he did put up respectable box score stats, completing 67% of his passes for 3,052 yards, 18 touchdowns, and 7 picks. That said, as I like to preach, stats don't tell the whole story. And when you turn on Teddy's tape, you definitely see some red flags. There's a narrative about Teddy amongst a small sector of Broncos country that likes to deem Teddy as Teddy check down and Teddy 2 yards. While I feel this narrative is somewhat overblown, it isn't completely overblown either. Sometimes throwing short the sticks and allowing your playmakers to do their job and pick up the first down is the right decision. It is what you should do. That being said, there are just countless examples of where Teddy would have receivers open downfield, but he would just pass it up for a shorter, safer throw underneath. It's really frustrating, honestly. And these situations do somewhat baffle me. I'm not sure if it's Teddy doesn't trust himself to make those throws. Perhaps he knows his limitations as a player. Or maybe he has the mindset of, hey, I've made my hay in the NFL playing a conservative brand of football. Why stray away from it? It's definitely one of the more glaring issues when you watch Teddy's tape. Teddy's durability is something else that is a major concern. He has suffered a litany of injuries over the course of his career, the worst of which was his horrific knee injury he suffered when he was in Minnesota back in 2016. Really, that injury was a major factor in the course that his career has taken. When he got healthy, he was never able to get his job back in Minnesota. They signed Kirk Cousins. The Vikings moved on. He ended up having a cup of coffee with the Jets. He was traded to New Orleans, where he played pretty well in relief of Drew Brees in 2019 when the Saints went 5-0. That team was loaded back then. Should have won a Super Bowl. Another video for another day. He then signed in Carolina in 2020, where it was pandemic-laced season. Overall, just a mess of a year, and frankly, he was playing pretty well in the first half of the season, and then he suffered a knee injury mid-season in a game against the Falcons. Teddy's play and the team's play in general just seemed to take a nosedive after his own injury, as well as an injury to Christian McCaffrey, which ended his season.
long story short, he gets traded to Denver, where it seems like his 2021 season just took a similar turn as his 2020 season. The first 3 weeks of the year, Teddy and the team were playing well. Teddy was playing pretty efficient despite losing Jerry Jeudy to a high ankle sprain for multiple weeks. The defense was holding its own despite injuries in the secondary. We were 3-0 against the Giants, Jets, and Jags. Life was good. Then Teddy suffers his first concussion of the season against the Ravens on a hit from Odafe Oweh before the end of the first half. Then he also suffers a knee injury, and that's where the season just totally began to unravel for the team. You know what happens from there? We finished the season 4-10. Teddy's effort against the Eagles gets questioned. Yada yada yada. I'm not here to rehash the pain of last season. And then, unfortunately, we all know how Teddy's season ended with that scary concussion against the Bengals, where he was knocked out unconscious, placed on a stretcher, and had to spend a night in the hospital. Just really, really scary injury. So at the end of the day, durability is a concern with Teddy Bridgewater. And if you'll look at the column here on your screen, on the left-hand column, you will see the player name and what type of free agent they are, whether they are an unrestricted free agent, a restricted free agent, or a exclusive rights free agent. The player age, which is a factor in making these decisions, quite frankly. And then in the right-hand column is their projected annual earnings according to either SpotTrack or Pro Football Focus, or in some cases, if neither one of those websites had a projected annual earnings, I just came up with a number based on their previous contract. So, according to Pro Football Focus, Teddy's projected to make $8.5 million, signing a 2-year, $16 million deal. And obviously, here in Broncos country, the biggest question has been quarterback, frankly, ever since we've lost Peyton Manning. And yet again, that same question is going to rear its ugly head. And the Broncos do have options outside of the big fish in Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers, which slowly but surely those dreams are dying, unfortunately. And Teddy Bridgewater, although he's not the most popular option among Broncos country, he is an option. I don't know. So at $8.5 million, I just feel like it's kind of a steep price tag for a player who's more of a game manager and someone who's dealt with, quite frankly, a lot of injuries in his career, and durability is a concern with Teddy Bridgewater. So while I do really like Teddy Bridgewater the person, I feel like it is in the best interest of the team to potentially look elsewhere for the quarterback position. So next up we have running back Melvin Gordon, who is a very polarizing player in Broncos country. You either love him or you hate him. He'll be entering his age 29 season next year, and Pro Football Focus projects he will sign a 2-year, $12 million deal for an annual salary of $6 million. Personally, I thought Melvin had a nice season in a tandem with Javonte Williams. He carried the rock 203 times for 918 yards and 8 rushing touchdowns, averaging 4.5 yards per clip. He also caught 28 passes for 213 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. That being said, he is entering the twilight years of his career while playing the position that, let's be honest, takes the most punishment in the most violent sport ever. $6 million per year is a really steep price tag for a player whose production I can match in the later rounds of the draft. There are plenty of examples of this. Elijah Mitchell, later round pick. James Robinson, undrafted free agent. Fan favorite here in Broncos country, Phillip Lindsay, undrafted free agent. Just countless examples of players who are high quality players matching the production of another high quality player like Melvin Gordon, but those players are going to get paid pennies on the dollar in comparison to a guy like Melvin Gordon, who's projected to make $6 million a year. I would definitely consider bringing Melvin back on a cheaper ticket, but at the end of the day, this is Pookie's backfield. So next up, we have wide receiver / punt returner Deontay Spencer, who is scheduled to be a restricted free agent. And for those who don't know, restricted free agents aren't just free to sign with whatever team they want to. Their previous team does have the right to match their deal.
they do essentially have right of first refusal, and they can also place tenders on the player, meaning that if another team wants to re-sign the player, they would have to give up a draft pick in return. Restricted free agents can also sign a tender, but more on that later. Deontay Spencer is going to be entering his age 30 season next year, and he is projected to earn $1 million. Personally, Deontay Spencer, oh man, he has been a decent return man for us. Reliable hands. Don't recall in recent memory him muffing a punt. That being said, he basically takes up a roster spot just to play one role. And quite frankly, if you're going to have a roster spot for strictly a return specialist, I'd want that guy returning kickoffs as well, and Spencer did not do that last year. Another issue I have is he's got potential to be used as a gadget guy in the offense with his speed, but the Broncos just haven't done that. And with a guy like KJ Hamler getting healthy next year, he's a potential option at that position, as well as someone in the draft. So Deontay Spencer is probably someone I could see the Broncos letting walk here because, frankly, I could see them wanting to get younger and more versatile at that position. Next up, we have offensive tackle Cameron Fleming, who, quite frankly, exceeded my expectations this season. Past few seasons, he has played at the Patriots, the Cowboys, and the Giants, and quite frankly, he was not good at all. Really struggled at the right tackle position in particular. And when he was signed to the Broncos, I was expecting him to simply be a camp body who was not going to make the 53-man roster. And his play in preseason, in my opinion, reflected that. And to my surprise, he made the 53-man roster. And when he got playing time, he actually played pretty well. His Pro Football Focus grade was a 71.7, and listen, Pro Football Focus isn't the Bible, but it is a good tool we can look at because, quite frankly, we don't have the time to study every player. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of stats, I'm not going to go back and look at every snap Cam Fleming played. He is going to be entering his age 30 season next year, and he is projected to make about $1.1 million annually on the open market. He was a quality player for us, but again, I just feel like you could get younger and, frankly, better at that position. Not the worst swing tackle on the planet, but there's someone else in my re-signings that I feel like would fill that position a lot better, so I'm going to spend that $1.1 million elsewhere and let Cam Fleming walk. Next up, we have a player who is probably going to cause some controversy for being on this list, and that is linebacker Alexander Johnson. And listen, it's not because I think Alexander isn't a good player. I do. I just feel like there are some legitimate arguments to let him walk. First of all, he is 30 years old, and he is projected to make $7 million a year, according to Pro Football Focus. And while I do feel like he would bring value in terms of the run defense, which did suffer when he did go down with a season-ending pectoral injury. That being said, he does tend to struggle in coverage, which is why I feel that the $7 million that he is projected to earn this year may be better spent elsewhere, and I do feel like the Broncos would be better off going in a different direction at linebacker. More on that later in the video. Next up, we have arguably the biggest disappointment from the 2021 Broncos, and that is cornerback Kyle Fuller. Now, Kyle Fuller, of course, was brought in as a free agent from the Chicago Bears, where he had previous experience with then Bears defensive coordinator and former Broncos head coach Vic Fangio. In 2018, in Fuller's last year under Fangio, he was regarded as one of the best corners in the league and had an all-pro season as a result. Now, the following two seasons after Fangio left to become the head coach of the Broncos, Fuller's play started to decline, and he was cut for cap casualty reasons by the Chicago Bears at the end of the 2020 season. And he was brought in by the Broncos as a free agent, reuniting him with Fangio in the hopes that they could recapture some of that former glory. Well, let's just say that did not happen. Kyle Fuller was absolutely terrible last season, posting a 47.2 Pro Football Focus grade. That is awful. Constantly, he was getting his hips turned by wide receivers, just absolutely looking lost in coverage. He played some at nickel when Bryce Callahan went down, and I will say he actually was slightly serviceable at nickel. That being said, he is projected to earn $5.75 million next year, according to Pro Football Focus. So, I don't know, man. I honestly could see a scenario where Kyle Fuller just isn't even in the league next year. I just don't think he has it anymore. Next up, we have a player who has played very good football for the Denver Broncos in his 3-year tenure here, and that is, of course, safety Kareem Jackson. Now, you may be starting to notice a pattern in regards to the age of these defensive players that I am electing to move on from. All of them are on the wrong side of 30. Now, Kareem has been a very, very good player in his time here in Denver after his long run in Houston where he played both corner and safety. Here in Denver, he has pretty much exclusively played strong safety and has been known as a downhill, thumping, hard hitter, just lays the wood on people, just a really hard hitter, and he's looked good in coverage too, but unfortunately the past couple of seasons the injury bug has really begun to bite him, particularly back injuries, and he is 33 and is projected to make $3.5 million next year. I don't know, man. A player on the wrong side of 30 with back injuries just kind of screams red flag for me. And although Kareem's been a good player for us, I feel like it's just time to move on, upgrade at the position. Hopefully find somebody that you can pair long-term with Justin Simmons as hopefully one of the best safety tandems in the league. And I do have some names in mind. More on that in a future video. Next up, we have another defender over the age of 30, and that is interior defensive lineman Shamar Stephen. A George Payton acquisition, came over as a free agent from the Minnesota Vikings last season, and I thought overall he played pretty well in spot time for us. Recorded 20 solo tackles and 17 assists. Didn't record any sacks, however. He is projected to make $1.5 million next season, and I don't know. I just feel like, again, that's another case scenario where I just want to get younger at that position, and it's nothing against Shamar himself, but that it's a league where you're trying to get younger and you're trying to get cheaper, and that is production that you can replace in the later rounds in the draft for pennies on the dollar. So Shamar Stephen, good player, but at the end of the day, I'm looking to get younger and cheaper at the position, especially interior defensive line. That's a position that really is going to need a massive overhaul for the Broncos, and the younger we can get at that position, the better. Finally, on the players that I would let walk, we have linebacker Micah Kiser, who we picked up off the Rams practice squad towards the beginning of last season, and frankly, he was a guy who just didn't get a lot of playing time last season. He spent a good chunk of the year on injured reserve, and even when he was healthy, he just really didn't play a ton. He only registered 7 solo tackles and 11 assists. May have played some on special teams, but wasn't a player that was particularly of note. He is $27 million and is projected to earn about $900,000 next season. I don't know. Micah Kiser is a player that I probably would not re-sign. That's a roster spot I could fill with an undrafted free agent or something along those lines. Again, just a wasted roster spot, unfortunately. Maybe he'll catch on somewhere else, but I don't see the Broncos re-signing Micah Kiser next season. Moving on to players that I feel the team ought to entertain re-signing, and starting off we have right tackle Bobby Massey. Now, last season, Massey was a very solid pickup for us, coming over as a free agent from the Chicago Bears. Now, he played in 14 games last season, starting 13 before being hampered down the line with a knee injury. And in those games, he allowed 5 sacks, in 796 snaps played while posting a 70 overall Pro Football Focus grade. Very solid overall production from a player who is 32 years old. Now, Massey is projected to make about $2.25 million next season, and Broncos general manager George Paton has expressed a desire to upgrade at the right tackle position when asked about positions of need to upgrade at the Combine this season. Now, Massey is a good option to sign as a potential insurance in the event that the team misses out on a top-tier tackle in the draft or in free agency. If we can't upgrade at the position right away, then Bobby Massey is there and is a very solid starter for us, and I feel would be able to fill that need nicely for now. He's a good duct tape solution, essentially. And hopefully, if we do miss out on a top-tier tackle, then we will draft someone down the line and potentially, if we hadn't already re-signed Massey, maybe bring him in down the line. His family has expressed their desire to keep their roots here in Colorado. I believe they have built a home and are looking to stay here in Colorado long term, so it's not like he'd be far away. And overall, I feel like Bobby Massey would just be a very good fit to re-sign with the team. Speaking of good fits, we have tight end Eric Saubert. Now, Saubert is primarily a blocking tight end for us in place of the two vertical threat tight ends that we have in Noah Fant and Albert Okwuegbunam. Now, Saubert did catch 8 passes for 47 yards last year, so not a very big threat in the passing game, but he was very solid as a blocker and when he got time for special teams last year. Saubert is projected to make about $1 million next year, according to Pro Football Focus. And honestly, I feel like that's a really good signing. And I would also entertain tight end in the draft. I feel like we need to get a true Y tight end, someone who can be both a vertical threat and a threat in the blocking game. Because, quite frankly, that's something we've lacked in Denver since, honestly, I want to say Julius Thomas. Noah Fant and Albert Okwuegbunam are good vertical threat tight ends, but they do not offer much in the blocking game. Speaking of someone who does offer something in the blocking game, however, we have tight end / fullback Andrew Beck. Now, Beck is somebody that has been around since 2019. We got him in a trade from the New England Patriots. He is a hybrid fullback tight end player who gets snaps at both positions. And for $950,000 projected, I feel like that's a very solid player to retain. And he brings excellent value on special teams. And new Broncos special teams coordinator Dwayne Stukes has preached that he wants players who can play at a high level. And frankly, high-level special teams play is something the Broncos have lacked these past few years. And one player who has brought that is Andrew Beck. So he's a player that I would definitely look to re-sign, as well as third-string quarterback Brett Rippon, who has been with the team a few years now. Very solid addition to the quarterback room, a good football mind, not the most accurate player in the world. He did start one game for us in 2020 when Drew Lock had a shoulder injury, and then Jeff Driscoll was Jeff Driscoll. Jeff Driscoll, oh God, that was such an awful signing. Anyway, but Brett Rippon is 25 and projected to make about $1 million. Solid third-string quarterback, a good addition to the quarterback room. Probably bring him in for camp and re-sign him to the practice squad like the team's done the past few years. I do figure that the team's going to bring in another body at quarterback. That's a different video, but Brett Rippon would definitely be a very solid addition to the quarterback room. Now, defensive players that I would look to re-sign, and here's a little bit more of an explanation behind my logic to move on from Alexander Johnson. That is re-signing guys in Josie Jewell and Kenny Young. Now, Jewell is a player who, like Johnson, is also coming off a season-ending pectoral injury. Jewell only played in 2 games, however, as compared to Johnson's 6. But in those 2 games, as well as in training camp last season, Josie Jewell was absolutely on fire. Every single day, he was making standout plays in camp. He had a really good preseason, Josie Jewell was a player who, frankly, was on the verge of a big breakout season, in my opinion, and he got robbed of it week 2 against the Jacksonville Jaguars with a torn pectoral muscle. Now, he is projected to earn $6 million next season, and he is 3 years younger than Alexander Johnson, which is why I feel like maybe re-signing Jewell is going to be the better move long term. He is a good player in the run defense and, frankly, in my opinion, underrated in coverage. He's not the greatest player in coverage, but I'm a person who's of the opinion that as long as you have a solid linebacker who can cover, you don't really need an elite coverage linebacker, especially in the day and age of NFL defenses that play a lot of nickel and dime. It's just not as necessary as it was several years ago. So for $6 million to re-sign Jewell and then another $2.5 million to re-sign Kenny Young, who again was a really solid player for us, mid-season pickup in a trade from the Los Angeles Rams. And if you pair those guys with Baron Browning and Justin Strnad, who both had solid moments last season, Browning more so than Strnad, but I feel like you have a very solid linebacking core, and if you were to bring someone in as maybe an undrafted free agent or off the street cheap pickup later in the offseason, and if they work out for you, great. But while Alexander Johnson's a very popular player, I feel like financially it makes a little more sense to re-sign Josie Jewell and Kenny Young. Following those two, we have edge rusher Stephen Weatherly, who we got in a midseason acquisition from the Minnesota Vikings last year. And frankly, we're a team who is starved of edge rush depth, and we need as many bodies as we can at edge. And Weatherly was decent for us, and for $1.5 million, a solid veteran player who has bounced around the league. He's been in Carolina, Minnesota, and I want to say Seattle. I can't recall if it was Seattle or not, but Weatherly has been around the league and 28 years old. I feel like that's a very solid investment to make, and it's a low risk, high reward signing, and you really can't go wrong there. And following that, we have the three guys who are predominantly special teams players for us, and same point as Andrew Beck, we are starved of quality special teams players, and we want to keep as many of our quality special teams players as we can. So we have cornerback Mike Ford, who we claimed off waivers last season at the beginning of the year from the Detroit Lions, who has been a very solid gunner for us, projected to make $1 million. At age 26, again, good special team signing. Then we have two exclusive rights free agents who essentially we have just right of first refusal for. They really aren't going anywhere. So we have Jonas Griffith, a very solid special teams player, and had some good moments when he got playing time at linebacker due to injuries. And at age 25, again, a very solid depth piece who could potentially become something later down the line. Then following that, we have another exclusive rights free agent in safety P.J. Locke at age 25. Locke's gotten many snaps at special teams, and again, another player where we're starved for quality special teams play, so it would not make sense to move on from P.J. Locke, in my opinion. To re-sign all these players, the Broncos would need $17.9 million, and currently as it sits, the Broncos have $39.2 million in free cap space, so that would leave them with roughly $21 million to work with. Now, of course, you're going to want to bring in some guys off the street, and of course, you're going to have to think about rookie contracts as well, but those are relatively cheap. Now, I'm sure you're asking yourself, Gage, there are a couple of players you're missing from this list. Where are they? Let's discuss. So here we have two players where I feel like it's a little bit interesting. I feel like a legitimate argument could be made to keep them or to let them go. And starting off, we have nickel Bryce Callahan, who has been a very solid player for us when healthy. The key word there being when healthy. And he's a defender who is on the wrong side of 30, but he has been a solid player. The problem is he has only played in 21 games over the course of 3 seasons for us. that is an issue. Health has been a very big concern for Bryce Callahan, frankly, even before he got to Denver, dating back to his Chicago days. Pro Football Focus is projecting that he will make $5 million annually on the open market next year. And I feel like there's a part of me that feels like there's a little bit too much of an asking price there. But there's another part of me that feels like it would be hard to replace that production. But you are taking a gamble with his health. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Would you retain Bryce Callahan? And if so, how much would you offer him? Would you keep it around the $5 million range? Would you ask him to maybe take a little bit of a haircut off the top? And speaking of hair, we have cornerback Nate Hairston, who is going to be an unrestricted free agent. And he's a player who has been pretty up and down when he's gotten playing time for us at corner. He is projected to earn the minimum for a player his age, or accrued seasons rather, which is about $990,000. So I feel like that's probably not a bad investment for a guy who may or may not make the 53-man roster and frankly may or may not make the practice squad next season. But I feel like bringing him in as a camp body would probably not be the worst thing in the world, or he might not go for that and he might just want to test the open market. Couldn't blame him there. So if you were to retain these players, it would cost you an additional $5.9 million against the cap. And frankly, I feel like, again, you could make the argument that you want both of these players on your roster and $5.9 million is fair value, but you could also make the argument that you could better spend that $5.9 million elsewhere. I don't know. It's an interesting argument. Let me know what you think in the comments below. So here we have 3 restricted free agents who I feel the team should offer tenders to. So those who don't know what a tender is where if a restricted free agent were to sign with another team, that team would then have to give that player's original team a draft pick as compensation. So, for example, if the Broncos were to place a second-round tender, which is the highest tender you can give, on edge rusher Malik Reed, who, quite frankly, is one of our better edge rushers on our team, and we're someone who's starved for production at that position, and at a player who is only 25 years old, that's definitely someone you need to keep around. And you would place a second-round tender on him because nobody's going to give a second-round pickup to sign Malik Reed. So that basically ensures that Malik Reed will be at your roster next year, will be on your roster next year. And each tender is assigned a set salary for that year. So the second round tender in this case is $3.384 million, which is frankly a very fair number in my opinion for Malik Reed. It's essentially a 1-year prove-it deal for him. And there are three types of tenders a team could issue. You have your second round tender, as I explained earlier. You have the original round tender, which is exactly what it sounds like. You would receive the original round pick that the player was drafted in return as compensation. So here we have 2 guys in Deshaun Williams and Calvin Anderson who are undrafted free agents, so we actually would not receive a draft pick in return, but this essentially gives us right of first refusal, which is the other type of tender, which you wouldn't get anything in return draft pick wise and compensation, but it allows you right of first refusal to match that player's contract in the event they want to sign elsewhere. And in Deshaun Williams and Calvin Anderson's case, they would be receiving the original round tender, each valued at $2.183 million for 1 year in a 1-year deal, which I feel again is very fair. Deshaun Williams, a solid interior defensive lineman who's really come on in the last couple of years, and Calvin Anderson, a swing tackle who was actually in competition with Bobby Massey for the starting job last season, and a player who maybe could compete for the starting job this season, but at worst is a very good swing guy who did unfortunately suffer a season-ending injury earlier in the season, but is a player that I feel the Broncos would be very smart to look into retaining. Now, it would take $7.75 billion to tender all 3 of these players, And after all the re-signings, not including Bryce Callahan and Nate Hairston, and placing tenders on these three players, the Broncos would have $13.5 million left in cap space to play with. Now, there is something you could do to potentially make a Bryce Callahan signing a little bit more cost-effective, and that is making some cuts. So the Broncos don't have any extremely obvious cut candidates. However, there are a couple of guys that could make sense if you are looking to maybe re-sign a guy like Bryce Callahan, or maybe trying to clear some cap for a free agent that you are coveting. And those guys are nose tackle Mike Purcell and punter Sam Martin. Now, Mike Purcell is a guy who is from the Denver area and has had decent production at the nose tackle position, but the past year kind of started to show signs of decline for Mike Purcell. And he is someone who was given a very ringing endorsement from former head coach Vic Fangio from their days together in San Francisco. So Purcell could be someone that may not be a fit, and maybe a position that the Broncos could be looking to get younger at. And then as far as Sam Martin is concerned, he's been a good punter for us. I mean, he was booming balls last year, in the words of Pat McAfee. But if there's a specialist on your roster if that specialist isn't one of the best at their position, like Brandon McManus is, I feel like you may be better suited to potentially look in the draft to get younger in the position. If you were to move on from Sam Martin, you would save $2.25 million, and if you were to move on from both of these players, that would save $5.75 million right there, and that would give you enough money to, again, re-sign a Bryce Callahan or bring in a free agent or something along those lines. So it's all about roster economics for George Paton. Does he want to retain guys like this, or does he want to move on for them and potentially replace those players with someone who would be a little bit more worth the money? I don't know. It's a very interesting question.
All right. So overall, a very fun video to make and a very fun exercise to do. It's really cool to kind of get a grasp as to where your team's cap situation is and which players they may or may not look to re-sign, or players they may or may not look to cut, and so on and so forth. It's all a very interesting balance of roster dynamics for General Manager George Paton and head coach Nathaniel Hackett, and it's really fun to kind of put yourself in their shoes in this hypothetical scenario and kind of pick your brain as to what you would do. And there were, again, a couple situations where I was struggling to make a decision on it. Like Bryce Callahan and Nate Hairston were guys that I literally couldn't. And let me know in the comments below, what would you do with those guys? I feel, again, like there's a legitimate argument that can be made either way. So I'd be very interested to see what the rest of Broncos country would do with those players. All right, so that's going to do it for the very first episode of the Sparkin Over Broncos podcast. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like, comment below if you want to add to the conversation. I'd be very interested, again, to hear your opinions on Bryce Callahan and Nate Hairston in particular. And if you would like to interact with me further, again, be sure to follow me on Twitter at Gage Madrid NFL. And for now, this has been the first episode of the Sparkin Over Broncos podcast. Peace out.